Well, can everybody hear me okay? If you came from Elmore Hall, you know that I've already lost my voice trying to speak over all of the noise for our church conference. So hopefully my voice will last long enough to make it through tonight. But thank you for coming. And I really don't know. I was just talking to Mary Kate. I'm still processing all that God is doing and done in me through this experience. So I'm not sure I'm ready even now to do this, but I feel like if I don't, this will help me. It'll force me to process some things, put it that way, to be ready every week. So what I envision, well, let me first start by saying I see some folks around that I don't know have been in this class before. So does everybody know what you're getting yourself into tonight? No. Okay. Well, let me back up. Back in the latter part of July through August, the church every 5 years blesses each of our staff, our pastoral staff, with a sabbatical. And so starting on July 21st, I started my sabbatical. For 6 weeks, I was away from the church. And one of the things that I have wanted to do and really felt called to do since the early 2000s when I was working on my doctoral work at Truett Seminary was my doctoral work is in spiritual formation, how we grow spiritually. And in all of my readings and all of the things that I went through, I ran across a spiritual pilgrimage. I'd never heard of such a thing. It's really not a Baptist thing. And it's this walk through part of Spain, ending up at Santiago de Compostela. And so I had really planned to do this in 2020 because I had a sabbatical in 2020. The problem is COVID-19 had other plans and there was no going to Spain in 2020. And so I had to wait until this year. And so I had wanted to do this. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Laura has actually been and done a Camino route. And so she had given me some information. There's a little booklet you see over there on the table. I had bought that and looked at that, read things online, watched videos. And in really the only way my wife could say it lovingly, she basically said, "You have no business doing this. You're not in shape. You really aren't ready." And boy, was she right. But I will say by day 4 or 5, I was getting more in shape and I did make it. But we'll talk about what a pilgrimage is tonight, but just so that you see and have bearings, this is Spain, as you can see. Santiago de Compostela is right here. And really, if you go another day's walk to Benestri, that is where the end of the road really is for the original Camino. I did not do that. The cathedral in Santiago was enough for me. And so that's what I did. But I did, there's 6 routes that, there are more than that really, but there are 6 that are institutionalized by the Catholic Church. And one is from the Francaise that actually starts all the way, I don't see it on the map, but right in here. And it's about a 6 or 8 week walk. I had no desire to do that. Then there's the Portuguese, which starts somewhere down in here and goes up. There is the Del Norte, which is right along the coast. And then there is, I'm missing one, Via de la Plata, and I don't remember where it is. But what I did is I started right here in Oviedo and walked to Santiago de Compostela. And you're looking at that going, okay, what was that, 30, 45 minutes? 220 miles. And so the reason I chose that one, and you'll hear about it in the history in just a minute, is that was the first route. That was the, oh, I thought y'all want me to come over there. Okay. That was what they call the Primitivo. That was what they think was the original route. And I'll talk about the history of all that in just a moment. So what brought us to this point that I'm talking about this walk? I've been really hesitant, to really be very honest. my fear is that I'm going to just bore people to death with, here's all my grandkids, that kind of a presentation. What's that? Home movies, yes. And so I've been really careful. I've tried to put some illustrations in, and Mary Kate was just very gracious to say that she's heard some of that come through in the sermons. But I'm trying not to just overdo that. But I was asked several questions when I got back, 3 of which I'm going to share. One was, was it what you expected? And in many ways it was, and in a lot of ways it wasn't. It was different, it was more. A second question was, what were the greatest takeaways? So really what we will go over the next several weeks are those lessons that I feel like God is teaching me through this experience. The third question really led us to what we're here tonight, or why we're here tonight, and that question was, how are you going to share this with others? And I thought, I hadn't really thought about that. My uncle, I was sitting on the patio at my parents' house in Abilene, and my uncle said, how are you going to share this? I mean, how God has done so much in your life and your heart, your mind. How are you going to relay that information? How are you going to share this? And I began to pray about that and think about that. And I thought, I don't know. And I was already scheduled to teach a class on Wednesday nights. We were going to be going through the Sermon on the Mount. So for those of you who saw that on the poster and said, I'm coming to a class about Sermon on the Mount, sorry, I shifted gears on you. I really felt God saying, you need to talk about this and process it, and people want to know. And there are several that have said, I can't be there, but could you show it somehow? So that's why you see a camera in the back of the room. We're going to video this and then upload it to our YouTube channel so that others can watch. I've actually had others in the community say, I want to be there, but I can't be there on the first Wednesday night. What do I do? And I said, well, hopefully we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. So as I have begun to really process this experience, I've done a lot of praying and a lot of thinking and a little writing. There's more writing to come. But it's unlike anything I've ever done before from the standpoint of concentrated time with God. And you think, well, you're a pastor, you're supposed to do that every week. But to spend 13 days with only what you need to survive on your back, and it's just you and God, and a few other folks that didn't really speak English much along the way, it forces a person to begin to listen, to slow down and listen. That's part of my problem. Some of you know that about me, some of you don't, but I don't slow down very often. My typical mode of operating my life is go hard, and in 6 weeks, take a couple of days and get away and recharge. That's typically how I've tried to do it. And I will tell you, now that I've been told I'm a senior adult, I need to make some changes. And so that's one of the things that you'll hear me say later on in this study, not tonight, but later on, is God really showed me some areas of my life that I need to make some changes. And so, but that's been a good thing. It's been a really good thing. So as I said, just kind of from a logistics standpoint, I did the walk from Oviedo. I flew to Madrid, and then I kind of tag team with the ministry that I have that offers retreats for pastors and their wives. And I had a group of pastors in Sevilla that wanted to talk to me about that. And so I took a train from Madrid to Sevilla on Tuesday of that week, the 22nd, and met with them that night. And then the next morning flew to Oviedo, and then on Thursday, the 24th, began the walk. And so if you take time to look at the little book that's over there, I think it's still over there. Yeah. It gives you the route and places that you can stop and stay. One of the things about the Primitivo is it's not very traveled. There aren't as many people that do this particular route, and so there aren't as many places to stay. Some communities might have only had 2 places that gave you an opportunity to stay. So you kind of plan out your day, plan out your adventure through those stages of trying to get from one town to the next. And again, walking with everything in that pack right there that I needed. One of the things that I learned about day 3 or 4 was that the water is safe to drink. And I don't remember if I have any pictures of it's not going to let me do that. Okay. Well, we went to the back. All right. So this is the church. This isn't in Santiago. This is in Oviedo. This is where you start. And so let me go into the history really quick, and then I'll come back to some of this stuff that we can walk through the pictures. Historically, not biblically, let me be clear, not biblically, but historically, the Apostle James did some missionary journeys to Spain and preached in Spain, and then went back to Jerusalem to raise support to start having ministry in Spain, and while he was in Jerusalem was martyred. Traditionally then, his bones, his remains, were taken to Spain, and then for whatever reason, forgotten about for 700 years. And then, according to tradition, a gentleman was led to a gravesite by a light that told him that these were the bones of the Apostle James. So word got back to the king at that point, who was in Oviedo. The Muslims had pushed into Spain, and really the only part of Spain that was still Christian was the northern part of the country. And so King Alfonso was the king, and the palace was in Oviedo. So when he got word that these bones had been found, he made the journey to Santiago to verify and authenticate these bones. Which he did, and built a small chapel there. And then 150, 200 years later, the cathedral that you'll see in just a moment was started. So in 1075 up to about 1150, they built this cathedral that you'll see in a moment. And now you can go under the platform area, I would call it, and there is a tomb there that you can look through the bars and see a gold box in the back that's where the bones of James are. So you may be already thinking, why did a Baptist pastor from Texas go all the way to Spain to see bones of somebody that may or may not be James? Good question. The answer is not to see the bones, but to experience God in that journey. What Alfonso started became an annual pilgrimage, and it was a spiritual pilgrimage. And a pilgrimage, by definition, is a journey typically to a religious site to grow deeper in our faith, to grow spiritually, and to be transformed. And that's exactly why I felt the need to go, just to spend that time alone with God, seeking God, and searching out what He would have me do with the rest of my life. What does the next 10 years of ministry look like for me as I get older and older and older? What does that look like? How do I finish well? How do I, all of those things. That was really what was driving me on this journey. And so that's really by definition what a pilgrimage is. And so Alfonso started that in the 8th century, and it's been going ever since. To the point now that there's over 5,000 or 6,000 people that make this journey every year. Different routes, but all ending up in Santiago de Compostela. And so that was the purpose for me going. I will say this, and I'll probably say it again later down the road, but I was very interested in the fact that I didn't meet a lot of people, probably 25, 30 people, because you start in the same place and you walk somewhat at the same pace, not necessarily together, but you end up in the same town each night and looking for something to eat and a place to stay. And so you start seeing the same faces And so over the course of those 13 days, I met about 25 or 30 people. And of all of those people, there were only 2 others that were on the Camino for any spiritual reason at all. And I thought, how interesting. Why in the world would you put yourself through this if it weren't for a spiritual reason? Because let me tell you, it was difficult for me. Of course, part of that was I was not in shape, as I shared with you earlier. Even though starting out every morning, it was about 50 degrees. By 7:30, I would be completely wet with sweat, not with dew, with sweat. And, you know, there were parts of it that were very, very difficult. Lots of ups and downs. And I thought, why would anybody do this if you're not on this for any spiritual reason?
Is there great scenery along the way? I mean,
wonderful scenery. I mean, we can start looking. So the way that you make your way through the countryside, and you'll see pictures, sometimes you're in a city, sometimes you're on a sidewalk, sometimes you're walking down the shoulder of a highway, sometimes you're out in the middle of nowhere. How do you know where to go? And next week we'll talk about trusting God, because you have to learn to do that really early on. But what you see there are this little shell, and you see one over on the table, that has become symbolic of the Camino. And there are different thoughts of how that came about. Some would say originally that's all that they carried, and then they would depend on people to give them that amount of food to eat along the way. Some would say that, and this probably has as much to do with it anything, is people would do this as part of their religious pilgrimage, and typically for penance or something like that. And so to prove that they actually made it, they would bring a shell back to their priest to say, see, I actually made it. But what has become of that is it's kind of become the symbol of the Camino. And so what you'll find along the way are these shells. And you see a little bitty miniature marker over there on the table as well. Those are about this tall actually, and you see them all along the route. And there were several times that I thought, God, I sure hope I'm not going the wrong way. I really need a sign. And I'd round a corner and there would one of those markers be. And always an arrow telling you, okay, go this way. And the shell, what's supposed to be, and I found a couple that weren't, but the base of the shell is supposed to point you in the direction you're supposed to go, because not always will you see an arrow. Sometimes it's just a shell. And sometimes they're a little bit hard to find. There's a countryside picture. But sometimes they're just on the side of the road, just there. If you're not paying attention, if you're not looking, you could walk right past it. Most of them, though, are on those markers, and I made it, so it's not like I got lost and didn't, still stuck in Spain somewhere. So it's not impossible. And having a book with the map helped, and that kind of thing. There's another that you can see the shell is kind of upside down. That's pointing that you're supposed to go this way. Lots of churches, but the interesting thing on this particular route, very few of them are open. From what I understand on the Francais route, a lot of them are open. You can go in and see or sit for a mass or whatever. But most of the churches were not open on this particular route. And very, very few restaurants or anything like that. The first day I didn't get to eat anything because I never walked through a village that had a restaurant. And I didn't know you're supposed to pack something. So about 6 o'clock that evening, I ate a can of Pringles with a Diet Coke. So that I found in a grocery store. The coffee's really good. I couldn't convince them that they need to make that mug about 6 times bigger, though, because they're really about that big. But when you pay by the cup, I didn't need more than one, so that was. So sometimes, like I said, the trail is just a little beaten path through the countryside. This is early on in the walk, and so you can see the rolling hills. This is one of the nicer, what's called an albergue, which is a hostel. And so you can do this on a budget. On the Primitivo, there weren't a lot of hotels, but there were some in some of the towns. But most often you would stay in something like this. And for about $18 a day, you could have a bed. This one, it was nice because I actually got this bunk. Nobody was on this bunk. And then there was another bunk here and another bunk there. And so there was one other gentleman in the bunk next to me from Belgium. And then these were just pods, and they had several of those through the building. Many of the albergues, though, were just a room like this with about 15 sets of bunk beds, and you may be, let's just say you hear all kinds of noises through the night. And being a small town West Texas boy that I am, sitting in the room waiting for a lady to come out of the shower so that I can go in was a little hard to get used to. But I mean, everybody's on the same trip, everybody's doing the same thing, and so you just kind of deal with it. Most albergues had separate men's and women's rooms, but not all of them. And so you just had to deal with what you had. But the trail was beautiful. One of the hardest days was this day, and we go up to the highest point, a little over 4,000 feet in elevation, and then start back down. But once I got about two-thirds of the way, half to two-thirds of the way through, it leveled out more. But the first part was very mountainous. And so you can see the trail. I mean, it just cuts across and then down and then back up. And so it was a little more strenuous than I was really physically prepared for, particularly carrying a backpack. And here's the other thing I learned that George from Belgium taught me in the picture of the albergue I just showed you. You know, I've been to Mexico. I've been to the Dominican Republic. I've been to other places, and even the Dominicans don't drink the Dominican water. And so I went with the mentality that the water I needed for the day was going to have to be in that backpack. Well, I don't know if you've ever backpacked before, but water is about 8 pounds per gallon. And I was carrying nearly 2.5 gallons. So just the water alone made my pack weigh more than I should have been carrying. And so George picked it up. He says, "What have you got in here? You need to streamline." And I said, "It's all water." He said, "Well, why aren't you drinking the water on the trail?" I said, "Because I'm not dumb and I don't want to be throwing up the rest of the way." He said, "No, the water here's safe." I don't think I have a picture for tonight. I'll find one for next week. But where you would stop for water, you would normally think you probably wouldn't even water your animals there. But folks were filling up their water bottles with this water, and I'm thinking, and you're drinking that, and you're not getting sick. So I got brave about day 5 and said, okay, I'm going to quit carrying so much water. And
did you let go some of the water in your backpack?
Yeah, I stopped carrying as much. I had a hydration bladder, which carried a 1.5 liters. And so I'd fill that because I could have the hose and just not have to stop, just keep sucking on it as I went. But I quit carrying the 2-liter water bottles on both sides of the pack. So that helped a little. But it was beautiful. Somebody asked me, John or somebody asked a little bit ago, was the scenery pretty? I mean, it was spectacular. But like I said, it was a lot of up and down. I wore out my shoes on about day 6. And if it hadn't been for the tape that I brought to put on blisters that I could then put on my shoes, I don't know what I would have done because I had to hold my shoes together with tape. But again, just really pretty, but pretty strenuous. And I would have not have made it without those trek poles either, which I was really glad I found a store in Oviedo to buy those because you can't carry them on the plane. So I couldn't take any with me.
Were there very many people that traveled alone also?
A few, but a lot of couples were together, but there were a handful. Like I said, there weren't that many that were on this particular route anyway. Now, when you get down within 100 kilometers, so I should have said this early on, you see over there on the table the Compostela, which is the certificate that you get if you complete the journey. You have to walk the last 100 kilometers. If you don't, then you don't get the Compostela. So a lot of people just start at that point and walk, or walk a little bit and to that point. But what happens is a lot of these different routes come together for that last 100 kilometers. So you start seeing a lot more people. But the first probably 5, 6 days, it was about 25 people or so. That is all I saw. And there was a couple from France, a young man walking by himself from Italy, a couple of guys, just buddies from Spain that were walking. Oscar, he was crazy. But yeah, not too many. In fact, most would say, "Who are you with?" And I'm saying, "I'm just here by myself." And you don't speak Spanish? Well, a little. The other interesting thing I will say, I'm back to what I was talking about earlier with this idea of being a spiritual pilgrimage. Once I did start having conversations with people, word got out really quickly that I was a pastor, because typically what you do is kind of like here. What's your name? What do you do? Where are you from? And the same kind of thing. What's your name? Where are you from? And why are you on the Camino? And so I would always say, I'm Brian. I'm from Texas, and I'm a pastor. So I'm on this, to get closer to God and grow in my faith. And usually by the time I got to, my name's Brian, and I'm from Texas, and then they'd say, "Oh, you're the pastor." So word got around with the group. In fact, George called it the Camino radio. So it's just interesting. But I will say that none of it was derogatory. Nobody said, "Oh, you're a pastor." I'm not like that. It was more like, "Oh, how quaint, a pastor." Because in Europe, Christianity is not really a thing. And that was very eye-opening for me. I had some really wonderful conversations with some young people that, I've heard of God. I've heard of Jesus. I'm like, for crying out loud, you're on a spiritual pilgrimage from one of his apostles. What do you mean you may have heard of Jesus before? But it was very interesting that a lot of people, they had no idea and no concept of this spiritual pilgrimage. But it dawned on me about day 4 or 5 having these conversations is these folks have never been around Christianity before, other than what they see old falling down churches. It's really kind of more, like I said, quaint. So it was interesting because it opened up some conversations that I got to have with folks that, George, I keep referencing the gentleman from Belgium. I would call him probably agnostic, but he didn't deny God, but just, not really a part of my life. But that was really most everybody's story. But like I said, it gave me opportunity to really have some wonderful conversations and connections now that I've kept up with a few of them on WhatsApp, and a couple from Czechoslovakia that you'll hear about more later, but and George and Javier and different ones. My shell actually came. Nowadays, it comes as more of a gift. You can purchase them, and I purchased several to give away when I got to Santiago. But the specialness of it is someone who's been on the Camino gives a shell to you. And about day 4, I was talking to a lady from London, and she was on it for a spiritual reason as well. And it was about her 5th or 6th time to be on one of the Camino routes. And I just asked her, I said, "I've been wanting to find a shell, but I can't find them anywhere. Where do you buy them?" She said, "Well, you can get them at different places. You can even order them on Amazon." But she said, typically they're given as a gift. And I said, "Well, that's a great idea. Well, when I'm in Santiago, I'll buy several so I can give as gifts." That next morning, or at noon, I was sitting at this chapel. I made it down all of those mountains, and I was sitting there deciding if I was going to die or not, and having a piece of bread, because I had learned on day 1 that you need to have something in your backpack to eat. And so I was sitting there at this wall, and she came up and she said, "I should have done this last night." And she took her shell off of her backpack and gave it to me. And so I started crying, and of course part of that was fatigue, I'm sure, but y'all know I'm a pretty emotional person anyway. So then it stayed right there for the rest of the hike. But anyway, though there were a few, back to your question, I kind of took a side route there, but there were people on the route, but not as many. But as we got closer to Santiago, it became somewhat, for a person that was on this trek for the solitude, it became a little annoying, because you would have groups of 20 or 30 college students that are singing. And I'm like, I just want to be alone with Jesus right now. Had they been singing religious songs, it'd have been different, but they were just having a great time. And but the first part of this walk through Asturias and into the beginning of Galicia was very few people, a lot of solitude. And, quite honestly, I couldn't walk as fast as everybody else. And nobody wanted to be around a sweaty white guy from Texas. So I was just doing good to survive. And so I didn't really walk with people much until the last day, which I'll tell you about in another session, but a young man from Italy. Lots of churches along the way. You'll see there on the table that kind of accordion-looking piece of paper. In order to prove that you made this walk, every day you have to get 2 stamps from different albergues, churches, a lot of times restaurants have them, and you just get a stamp at each of those places. And so these kids, you can't really see in the picture. Let me see if I can make it zoom. They had it figured out. So you could get your stamp right there, and then for €3, you could buy a little cup of lemonade. So they had their little business set up at the church, which I thought was pretty smart. Again, just more of the trail. It was varied. Highways, there's a chapel. You see these every few miles. It's because wherever there were 3 or 4 houses in the countryside, they would build a chapel. It's all rock, and rock on the roof too, slate on the roof. They were all locked, so I couldn't really go in, but this was a hike down to a lake, which was a lot of down, which always means then you get to go back up. But it was beautiful. This, you can't really see it, but this is an outdoor patio cafe. And so I set my sights on that, and I said, it may take me 2 hours, but I'm going to get there and I'm going to stop. There's one of the markers, that, like I said, the little miniature over there. But this is, once we got into Galicia, you can't see it, but there's actually kilometer markers there. In Asturias, they didn't have that. They didn't figure you wanted to know how far it still was. But once we crossed into what we would call a state, but Galicia, which is another entity, they started putting kilometer, so you could kind of gauge how much farther is this. But again,
Regular road behind there for cars?
yeah, like I said, some of this you walked on the shoulder of a highway. It wasn't all just through nature. Some of it you felt like you were in somebody's backyard, because you would walk through and their porch would be literally right there and their door right here, and you're just walking by going, boy, in Texas, somebody'd shoot you if you got this close to their house.
Not to sound worldly, but is there cell phone service on this trip?
There is. That was very helpful because I learned, back to the lodging issue, if you do it the way that was done originally, you just show up in a town and hope and pray that you can find a place to stay. Because I needed to have the security of knowing I had a place to stay, I would call ahead and book a place. Now, the very first day, I got 6 hours into the trip, and I was supposed to stay, and the first stop was Grotto. I was supposed to stay there. And so where I stopped to have lunch, which I didn't have lunch, I had a granola bar. I thought, well, I'm going to get on my phone and book a place through my little booklet. Here's a nice albergue. I'm going to go ahead and reserve that. So I did through bookings.com. And I got an email verification. You have a room waiting, or a bed waiting for you when you get there. So about 2 hours before I got there, I ran out of water. Didn't have anything to eat. And so when I walk into Grotto, I think I better have a bed. Well, I'm just going to collapse. And I walk into the office, and the young lady's behind the counter, and I said, "Tengo una reserva." I have a reservation. She says, "Completo." We're full. And I said, "But I have a reservation. Here's the email." And she looked at it and she goes, "Completo." So I didn't have a bed. And that's when I learned that my cell phone didn't work in Spain. I could use the internet, but I couldn't make phone calls because I started trying to call other places and my phone wouldn't. I could call home, I could call Christy, my wife, but I couldn't call somebody in Spain. So 3 hours later, with Verizon, I was able to call numbers in Spain. So at that point, I called another albergue, which was another 3 miles up the mountain. And he said, well, I just picked up a bunch of people to bring from Grotto, but I don't have any more room, so you're going to have to walk. And I said, well, at this point, if I just have a bed, I'll be okay. So I made that walk. So that's why I decided that may not be the way it was historically done, but by golly, in order for me to survive, I'm going to have to know I have a place to stay. And so I started calling ahead and talking to a live person. And anyway. But yes, there were places you didn't have service, but like in some of those really mountainous down in the valleys. But at that point, you know where you're going. And so, but typically I had service. Just pictures along the way. This is actually a first century bridge that's still there. I did walk across it, so it still holds. I thought this was interesting. You see these little pilgrim guys all over the place. In Spanish, that's peregrino, so a pilgrim, and that's what a person on the Camino was called. And it was interesting to watch them make it as well. This is what is called Monte de Gozo. So this is the Mount of Joy. And if I zoom in, you can see the spires. So this is a cathedral in Santiago. So this is my last day. There will be other pictures along the way. But I didn't want to just spend our whole time tonight showing you pictures. But this was the place that's the first point on the journey on this particular route that you can see the cathedral. And there's, if you haven't ever seen me clean shaven, that's me clean shaven. That is the cathedral that was, like I said, started in 1075 and finished around 1250. Very ornate, very beautiful. But you see, these are all images of James. And they're just throughout the entire building. So that's it. Those are the pictures for tonight. So quickly, just on a couple of the more logistic things. I told you about the lodging. I told you about my issue on the first day of not having anything to eat. I just assumed, and I never read anything that said differently, that their meal times were similar to ours. That was a terrible assumption to make. So when you're trying to walk 15 to 20 miles a day, unless you start at 6:30 in the morning, you're probably not going to be, at least at my pace, I wasn't going to be where I was going to stop by 4 o'clock. Well, the way their meals work there is 7 to about 8:30 is desayuno, breakfast, which usually consists of bread and butter, or what they call tortilla, which is, I would call a quiche. Yeah. It's a thickness like quiche, but it's mostly potato. And it's usually in a pie plate, and they just cut you off a wedge, and you pay for it and you eat it. That was typically breakfast. So for me, it was usually a cup of coffee and basically a hoagie bun that they cut in half and toasted, and I put butter on. That was pretty much my breakfast every day if I got it. Then almuerzo, which in Mexico would be lunch, is a snack about 10:30. And it's usually tortilla. You might find something else, but that's usually about it. Their main meal is called comida, and that's from 2 to 3:30. And then dinner, if you miss comida, cena, dinner, starts at 9 at night. Well, 9 at night, after I walked 18 miles, the last thing I was thinking about was getting dressed up to go to dinner. At that point, I was trying to find my bunk bed. And so there were a couple of days I didn't make it by 4 o'clock. And so you would get there and they would say, kitchen's closed. We can serve you a beer. So I would have toast usually or nothing. So I learned that you need to know what the meal times are in order to plan your day, which also meant that I started walking a little earlier too, so that I could make sure I was there before 3:30 and actually get food. Now, I will say, yes, ma'am.
It doesn't seem like you had enough calories to go through all the walking that you're
That's why I lost 15 pounds.
doing. You need more.
So I will say comida, that meal, was if you found a place that catered towards the peregrinos, the pilgrims, they had what they called menu del dia. So the menu of the day, or the food of the day, and it was typically a 3 or 4 course meal. And the portions were absurdly large. And usually you would have different choices for your main. You could have a salad or soup. The soup would come out in a bowl about like this and about that deep for one person. And then you got your main course, which a lot of times I would go with what I knew, which was usually some kind of beef. They had, what was it? Sorpresa de cerdo. Pork surprise. And so I asked the waiter, I said, so what is the surprise? He said, well, it could be snout, it could be ears. And I said, I'll go with the beef. So I never had the surprise pork. But the food was all really good. Salad was good, the soup was good, but it was a lot of calories in that one meal. Pasta a lot of times, and then a dessert. You got a dessert with that. And so typically that was in the range of $15 to $20. But if that's your only meal for the day, that's pretty cheap for your food for the day. And so, like I said, I learned really quickly the meal schedule. Didn't want to go without food any longer than I had to. I gave you the history already, and this idea of the spiritual aspect of it. One of the things that I've come back to in thinking about this and really trying to process it is the Camino, in a lot of ways, I think, is a perfect metaphor for our walk with Jesus every day. You'll hear me talk in a session or two from now about the rhythm of it. Basically, you get up. You do with what you have, and you carry as little as possible. So I had basically 2 days of clothes in my pack and the one I was wearing. And then usually when I got to where I was going, I would try to eat, then go shower, then wash clothes in the sink, hang out my clothes on a line to dry, and then hope they were dry the next morning so that they could go back in my pack. And so you get into this rhythm of getting up. Where I was going with that is, as strange as it sounds, I would sleep in my clothes. Because if you're in an albergue with 16 of your closest friends you've never met before, you don't want to wake them up, although you're disgusted with them when they wake you up. But you get up in the dark, you pack your bag in the dark, you brush your teeth if you're going to do that, and you get out and get on the road and start walking. And so you get out, you start walking. After about an hour, you hope to come to a village that had a restaurant where you could find something to eat. You sit down for a little while, have a cup of coffee, have some toast, then you start walking again. And then you get to where you're going, you drop your pack, you go find lunch, you come back, you shower, you wash your clothes, you hang your clothes, you go find something to eat if you can and visit with folks, and then you go to bed. And the next day you just get up and do it again. I was trying to blog in the afternoons, and by about day 7, it just got to be too much. And so if you were following, some of you I know were following my journey, you notice it just stopped. And from the physical fatigue, but also just the overwhelming aspect of what God was doing in me was just too much to process. I could have sat down and written something, but it probably wouldn't have been worth reading. And so I just quit. And tried to get back to it when I've gotten back, but there was just that rhythm to it. And so this idea of the Camino being a metaphor of our Christian walk really we need that rhythm in our own lives with Jesus. Getting up, spending time with Him, in prayer and scripture reading. And then the fact that really at the heart of this journey was a desire from the front end to start here and somehow make it to there and not give up in between. And so that's kind of like our spiritual pilgrimage, is we decide we're going to follow Jesus. We don't know all of the mountains that are going to be between here and here. We don't know how hard it's going to be. We don't know the ups and downs, but we know we want to follow Jesus. And then we just set out and start this journey with Him, and then look for the signs along the way to make sure we're still following Him. But yet every morning getting up and doing the things we know to do, trusting that He's going to direct our path. Psalm 119, verse 105, I think it is. Yes, your word is a lamp for my feet and a light to my path. That was a passage that came to my, when you're walking on a little path, you think, especially when you start out in the dark, you need a light for your path. And so it's the Camino for me became this metaphor of what it looks like to follow Jesus every day. Just this rhythm of getting up, starting out, looking for the signs, trusting God to lead, paying attention, doing my part. God will show us, but we have to be paying attention. You hear me say this a lot. If we ever feel distant from God, God didn't go anywhere. God is always with us. The issue is with us not being aware and not paying attention. And so, just like the little shell kind of buried in the dirt on the side of the road, if you're not paying attention, you may miss some of those signs. In my experience, God has always been faithful to pull me back onto the right path. But that's the pilgrimage. That's we get up every morning, we spend time with Him, we set out to follow Him, we look for signs along the way, and then we realize along the way that we're not on this journey alone. Look around this room. Each of us are on this journey together in following Jesus. And so this idea of a pilgrimage is deeper than just going to Spain and walking. Each of us are on a pilgrimage to follow Jesus. And so that's kind of where I wanted to end up tonight, is just this idea of each of us. And really what I envision tonight was more of a picture show and here's what happened to me kind of a thing. And I don't want it to be about me. What I want to point us to is the spiritual aspect that each of us have in this journey, this pilgrimage with Jesus. And so in the next sessions, I'll have some pictures, I'll have some illustrations, but I want us to really think about what this day-to-day walk with Jesus should look like for us. Next week, we'll talk about trusting Him. There were days, like I said, God, I sure hope you show up, because I'm not sure I'm going to make it. As I said, as the journey went on, 4 or 5 days into it, my body adjusted a little bit. The walk got less strenuous, and so I was able to make it. Somebody asked, what would you do differently? I said, well, I would have trained. I had not walked more than half a mile before I went on this trip. Probably the longest I walked in preparation was going from different gates at the airport on my way to Spain. Because I was carrying my backpack at that time, and I thought, this is my training. This is all I've had. And if I could do something differently, I would train, not because it's impossible to do. It is difficult, it's strenuous. But because what I noticed about day 3 is on those really steep 1 mile stretches where you think I'm not going to make it, what I found myself doing is if I can just get to that big rock right there, I'm going to stop and I'm going to take a drink and I'm going to sit there for a minute and catch my breath while 40 other people pass me. It's not a race. And what I began to notice was I was more focused on surviving than I was on listening to God. And so in our spiritual walk with Jesus every day, we need to condition ourselves in that and not be so focused on surviving that we miss hearing His voice. I would do that differently. I would train more. and be more physically prepared. One of the gentlemen along the way said, the first week is for your feet to adjust. The second week is for your body to adjust. And the third week is for your mind to adjust. And I thought, that's very wise. But on week 3, I'm still hoping for my feet to adjust. So I would change that part of it. But think about that in the sense of how it applies to your walk, to your pilgrimage with Jesus every day. Is His Word a guide for you, a lamp to your feet? As I said, another passage that came to mind as I was talking to the people is Matthew 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. On that path, there were times it was really narrow, sometimes hard to find. You come to a fork in the road that may have 4 or 5 forks in the road, and you're trying to figure out, okay, which one of these? And 9 times out of 10, there would be a marker somewhere within sight that you'd know, okay, that way. But sometimes it was hard to, there was a little trust involved. Well, I know this is the way I'm supposed to be going. I'm just going to keep going until I see a sign. I will say, and I'll probably mention this again next week, but there was one city that I stayed in, and you had to walk off of the path to get, the actual way, the Camino, to get to the albergue. So it was a few blocks off of the way. So when I got up the next morning, I couldn't remember. Okay, did I turn right or left? How do I get back to the way? So I looked at the map, I'm looking at the city, I'm looking, thinking, okay, well, I know that's the direction I got to go. So I start walking. And about, 400 or 500 yards down the road, I'm not making this up, there was a sign in Spanish that said, "Pilgrim, if you're here, you're going the wrong way." And I said, "God, thank you." And so I turned around and walked back until I found a yellow arrow and was back on the right path. But there were days that you just need to look for those signs. And so I want us to think about this path that we're on and know that it is not the easy way. The world is on the wider road. Jesus calls us to the narrow road. And so think about that analogy as well as we go through this time together. And then one that really became very meaningful, really two, but James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 say, "Consider it pure joy." I found it hard to do this. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything." As I made that journey, I thought, God's working on my perseverance because I'm not sure I'm going to make it. But He grew that. Romans 5, 3 through 5 say, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." So, again, in our relation to our spiritual pilgrimage, there are going to be difficult days. There are going to be days we're not sure we're going to make it. There are days that we go through trials and suffering, just like some of those days that I felt like I can't go up another. At that next turn, it better start going down or I'm going to just sit down and cry. And I'll get to that turn and it was another 300 yards straight up. And I'm thinking, I don't think I can keep doing this. We're going to have those days with our spiritual walk where things just seem uphill. But stick it out, stay with it, and trust God, because He has a plan and He will grow you through that. So I want us to give you some things to think about between now and next week. Think about how your spiritual pilgrimage is similar to what I've described with this walk. How do you relate that to your personal spiritual pilgrimage? The second thought that I had that I want you to think about is, where do you place your trust? One of the things I learned is I didn't need a whole lot. You learn what you need and what you don't need. And by about day 5, I was leaving things at Albergues. I thought, I haven't used that yet. I don't need it. And if I need it that badly, I'll find it somewhere else, but I don't need to keep carrying it. And so, where do you place your trust? What are you carrying? That's the third thing. What are you carrying that you don't need? Is your trust fully in Jesus, or do you have other things as well? I'll talk a little bit about that this Sunday as well, but think on those 3 things. Meditate on those things as we go through this next week of how is your spiritual walk a pilgrimage? Are you trying to grow spiritually? Are you seeking to deepen your faith? Are you wanting God to transform you? Where do you place your trust? Is it in your own ability, your bank account, your family? Or is it truly in Jesus? And then thirdly, what are you carrying that you don't need to carry? Thoughts or questions?
I've got one.
Okay.
You say you've wanted to do this for a long time, so you've bound to look into everything. You probably did some studying about the trip. Were your expectations what you had thought they were going to be, or was it completely different?
I said that kind of early on. They weren't. Some of the things were what I expected. The solitude, the places to stay were actually, I had built them up to be a lot worse than they were. It was an adjustment. I mean, like I said, waiting in line behind other people to use the same shower, some of different sex, just, that was an odd thing for me. But I had read so many things about, spray your mattress down with things because you're going to get bed bugs and you don't want to bring bed bugs home to your house, and you need to spray your backpack before you even go. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is going to be hell on earth. And it really wasn't as bad. You also learn that if I get bed bugs, I just get bed bugs. It'll be one other thing to go along with the experience, but you just quit worrying about it. So a lot of things were what I expected. And there were a lot of things that I don't know that you can read enough and talk to enough people to truly give you a good understanding of what you're about to do. So there were some expectations that weren't met. I mean, I didn't know what to expect, and so it was different than what I expected. So I wouldn't say it was completely different than what I expected, but there were things that I didn't expect. Part of it was just I still am, and I know that's a strange answer, but I feel like God did so much that I'm still processing a lot of what that means and how is that going to be. One of the questions, I journaled a lot on the way, even though I didn't blog every day, I journaled every day. And I just, along the way, I just knew that there's some things that need to change in my schedule when I get home. One of the things, though, that a question I wrote to meditate on was how am I going to be different when I come back, when I get back? What's going to have changed? And then how am I not going to get back into the same rut that I was in before? Because God used this to clarify a lot of things for me. Not what I was wanting. So back to your question of did what you expect to happen? Many of you know me, know my personality, my mentality. I'm a very type A person. I make to-do lists, and if I do something that's not on my to-do list, I'll add it just so that I can check it off. I'm a planner, and so I went with God, show me what the next 10 years of my ministry is going to look like. What do you want me to do? How do you want me to finish? I turned 60 a few weeks ago. I looked up and I was already the pastor here 10 years. So in 10 more years, provided y'all don't decide you don't want that old of a pastor, in 10 more years, I'll be 70. I mean,
Nothing wrong with that.
no offense. Yeah, some of you are saying, oh, to be 70 again. My point is those 10 years are going to go fast. And so how do I remain effective? God, what do you want me to do so that the last thing I want to do in ministry is coast. The last thing I want this church to experience is we love him, but my gosh, I wish he would leave. I've been around churches that are like, that guy should have retired 10 years ago and he's still at it. I don't want to be that guy. I want to finish well. I want to do everything God wants me to do. And if that's here for another 10 years, then I'm all for that. But I went asking God every day, God, what does the next 5 years look like? What does the next 10 years look like? I didn't get that answer.
I bet he said wait till the night so you can get fed.
Maybe so. What I got one morning though, and you've probably heard me share this, that was my prayer every day. Draw me closer, talk to me, show me what you want me to do. And I didn't see the emotion coming. I didn't hear an audible voice, but as clearly as we're looking at each other right now, I heard Jesus say to me, when I asked that question, what do you want me to do? What does the next 10 years look like? I heard Jesus say, you are my child and I love you. Let that be enough for now. And while that seems really, really simple, and it was very liberating for somebody with my personality. Because what I heard him saying in that was, you don't have to worry about that. You're my child, and that's enough. You don't need anything else. Get up every morning and do what you know to do. Now, I still want to know what the next 5 to 10 years looks like. But it was very liberating because at that point, what I meditated on the rest of that day and even to now is ministry shouldn't be a performance. I shouldn't feel the pressure to perform. I mean, there's a person in the room that knows I'm not a professional. So that's a running joke with someone in the room. I don't have to perform. And that took a lot of pressure away to say, just be you. You hear me say this to you a lot. It's easy for me to preach and harder for me to live. And that is, God cares more about who you are and who you become than what you do. And he reminded me that day, that applies to me too. He cares more about who I am and who I become than what I do. Now, I do believe he's called me to pastor. I do believe he's called me to pastor here. But more importantly, I'm his child. And that comes first. So that was a good reminder. So that was a long answer to your question, Joe. In a lot of ways, it met my expectations. In a lot of ways, it didn't. But there were other things that happened that far surpassed that. Another question I've been asked is, would you do it again? Initially, I said yes, but probably not that route. But the more I look at the pictures, I'm like, if I trained, I might do that route again. I don't know. But I would love at some point to take Christy and do it, my wife. Do some of it. Not probably 220 miles. I'm not sure she would be up for that. But anyway, other questions, other thoughts?
No, I just had a thought that it appears that you're shifting your priorities in your life. The whole road, in a way, allowed you to shift priorities in your life.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a really good way to put it. I mean, it helps you reprioritize. And we'll talk about that in the session about, what it takes to really follow Jesus. We put so many other things in our lives that aren't necessarily helpful. And some may be really good things, but don't help us follow Jesus. If y'all have been around through Holy Week, typically moving into Holy Week, I usually make not a big deal, but I always reference Lent. And I know as Baptists, that's not something we really practice. But the idea of Lent is reprioritizing. The idea of Lent is, what is it that I've put in my life that is keeping me from really following Jesus? And what do I give up to follow him more closely? And so it was. I mean, part of this was, it strips you down. I mean, physically, emotionally, mentally, it strips you down to the point that it's like, I don't need all that. I'm doing just fine with these 3 things on my back. I'm making it just fine. I'm going to make it another 10 days. I can do this. God will do this through me. So it does help you reprioritize. And that is so important for each of us to do that regularly. Other questions, other thoughts? Thank y'all for staying with me through this. I felt like I talked to my assistant today. I said, the last thing I want to do is them go, oh, another, what we said, a photo album or a slideshow. Yeah, here's my family reunion. I want us to focus on the application more than just come and listen to Brian talk about his experience. Part of this, as I said, is helping me unpack it and process it myself. But what I desire in this is for each of us to grow in our understanding of what it looks like to follow Jesus here, not necessarily in Spain, but here. All right. Next week we will talk about trusting God. But let me pray, and we will be dismissed. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for everyone that came to listen. Lord, I pray that it will help each of us grow in our understanding of what it looks like to follow you each and every day. Lord, I pray that as I continue to process this, that you would continue to speak to me and then through me to those that come. Lord, if it's just about a guy that went on a walk with a backpack, then that's not worth listening to. But if we can truly see you in it and the lessons we learn about following you each day through it, Lord, I pray that that's what we would do. So use each of us and speak to each of us as we go through this journey together. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.